Hi there. Welcome to British Muzzleloaders on Bloke on the Range. Right. As a follow-on to the chap's immensely successful Black Powder Mad Minute video, he asked me to perhaps conduct a follow-on experiment using some rifles that he didn't have access to. Looking at his and looking at contemporary rifles that I own, well, the Martini-Henry came to mind. So, let's stand by for a 1 minute, mad minute with the Martini-Henry.
The late 1860s and early 1870s marked a huge paradigm shift in most armies of the Western world as new technologies matured and breech-loading rifles replaced the muzzle-loading weapons used for generations before. In the British and Empire armies, this was not any different. Now, of course, there were military breech-loading rifles as early as the 1840s, and they had been used to great effect in action, namely by the Prussians with their Dreiser rifle. Famously, the greatest and earliest trial between breech-loading rifles came in 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War, and saw the aforementioned Dreiser pitted against the French CHAP. Both of these represented the first generation of such arms, as they used paper cartridges of varying design. It would take the full development of the self-contained metallic cartridge for breech-loading technology to come into its own. In Britain, this came first with the adoption of the Snyder-Enfield in the late 1860s. This rifle was produced as an immediate replacement of the venerable P-53 Enfield, but served only as a stopgap until the intended service breechloader could be designed, produced, and issued. This rifle, adopted in 1871 and issued from 1874, was the famous and hugely successful Martini-Henry. It's important to realize that this paradigm shift was occurring all around the world, with, at first, muzzle-loading weapons being converted into breech-loaders, and the purpose-designed patterns coming into service subsequently. Some followed closely the design of their predecessors, while others were quite different in manufacture and design. Some, like the French, kept their already successful design and converted their rifles to simply accept metallic cartridges instead of the paper, as was the case with the conversion of the CHAP into the Gras. So, with the enormous selection of 1870s and 1880s military breechloaders to examine, the CHAP, as we all know from Bloke on the Range, decided to embark on a simple yet hugely interesting series of comparisons, pitting these rifles against each other in a simple test of rapid fire, much like the Firepower series on this channel. We thought it might be interesting to complement the CHAP's mainly European collection with the Martini-Henry, and acting as a special guest star, the earlier Snyder-Enfield. I hope you enjoy it.
So for this suit, of course, I'm going to be using my trusty old Mark I Martini-Henry. Viewers of my channel will be most familiar with that. As far as ammunition goes, I'm going to be using my version of the service round, which is about a 500 grain bullet, paper patched, nominally 45 caliber. The cartridge is typically known as the 5.77-450, and it's a bottleneck round, but perhaps quite contemporary of the era, 1880s or so. Travels at around 1,200 feet per second, which will be more than enough for the stipulation of this particular experiment, which is, of course, as the chap alluded to in his videos, only 50 meters, standing from the pouch. For that, I'll be using my set of 82 pattern valise equipment, as was worn in the British Army in the 1880s and 90s. So, stand by for 1 minute of, mad minute. With the Martini-Henry. Let's go.
The target used in the CHAP's Black Powder series is a simple 1 meter square paper target, in this case with a circular aiming mark and some figures of animals. I used the small classification target from the late World War II timeframe, as it was what I had on hand at the time. The 1 meter standard could easily be applied after shooting. These practices have all started with one round chambered, and the commencement of firing started on some sort of audible signal. I used a simple 1 minute repeating timer on my watch. The Martini practice went off without any undue dramas. The ammunition chambered well enough, and the rifle chugged along nicely.
So let's count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah? No, and we got, that's an old 303 hole. So 12 hits within a meter. There's the target stipulation from the aiming mark, which I was aiming at approximately a 6 o'clock hole on this small classification target from a slightly different era. That said, there's 12 hits within a square meter, so that meets the stipulation for the practice. Well, just because, well, I'm Canadian, and the contemporary service rifle in Canadian service was in fact the Snyder-Enfield. So I thought, all right, let's do the challenge with the Snyder as well then. Here you go. Of course, the Snyder is .577 in caliber. And for this experiment, I'll be using my own loading, as it were, which includes the X-Ring Services .600 flat-based bullet on top of 62.5 grains of 3F powder, with a little bit of cornmeal filler in there. There's more information about this particular round in a number of videos on my channel, as a matter of fact. Anyway, here we go. Mad Minute Challenge with the, in this case, the Mark III Snyder-Enfield long rifle.
Much like I had done in the past when rapid firing with the Snyder is concerned, I brought the rifle to the full cock position rather than the half cock in order to load. This minor deviation from the prescribed drill gives just a small advantage in time.
So obviously a little bit of a slower rate of fire for the Snyder, but all the hits are within that square meter, so they're all good. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. 8.
So, 12 hits for the Martini and 8 hits for the Snyder. Now, I've featured both of these rifles on the channel before as part of the Firepower series, and these results compare favorably to those gained in previous experiments. I'd say that both practices could be termed decent representations of the respective capabilities of these rifles. Now, at this time, I thought that we'd try something a bit different for the channel, and rather than listen to me drone on about things, well, why not have the chap himself on to talk about his project and put some of the results he had into perspective. I hope that you enjoy this rather more long-form discussion. Well, hi, Fab. How are you?
Hi, Rob. Nice to speak to you at last.
It's wonderful. Yeah, it's been a while. This is something that we've talked about, online for quite some time now, and it's been in my court that I haven't got my act together. But now I have. The footage was filmed some time ago, but I've now been able to commit some time to put a little bit of a project together. And
Yeah,
hopefully...
I noticed that you were dressed a little inadequately for November in Canada.
Yeah, what gave it away? The shorts? Or the white,
yeah.
or the white cover on the hat.
The white cover, the shorts. Yeah.
So your series, Fab, is something that is very interesting to me. Obviously, the focus of British muzzleloaders is what it is, but your collection of arms is something that sort of broadens that aspect of, well, as we're talking about here, sort of breech loading, 1870s, 1880s era arms. And for me, anyway, I find that very interesting because it's not something I'm very familiar with. Maybe if you wouldn't mind just sort of bringing us together and giving us a bit of a background to your project and where it came from.
Well, initially it was actually just what I was aiming to do was just do a comparison between the single shot breech loaders that had a bolt action system and those that weren't. I mean, initially, most of the systems, well, they start with the transitionals, but most of them are not bolt action. And then you get the advent of the Dreiser, Chassepot, and so on. And the question was, is there any real advantage in terms of single shots between the bolt actions, which we all know nowadays, and the non-bolt actions, which have basically disappeared apart from random hunting rifles? The idea was in my head that no, there isn't. It was purely a consequence of the advent of repeating mechanisms, which then heavily favored the bolt actions. Then I thought, how could I test such a theory? The only thing I could really come up with was simply an ease of use. And then that led to Mad Minute, which we've been pursuing on Bloke on the Range forever, which pretty much comes down to the same idea. How fast and easy is it to run and shoot adequately with the given rifle? So I also wanted to give an idea of the drill a bit of the time. So they weren't shooting prone with piles of ammunition ready. They didn't have stripper clips. They were loading from pouches, usually on command. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I tried to incorporate that in a way that could be repeatable.
Right.
I didn't need any fancy setup. I did it at 50 because that's the range access that I have. And back in the first one, I chose the two rifles which I thought were I had them, and two, they were a good point.
I have to have the arms first in order to use them.
Yes, that is something that is very welcome. Comments are very welcome, but of course, immediately says, "Can you do it with this, that, and the other?"
Yeah,
I would love to, but we need to have access to the firearms, and unfortunately, everything past 1870 requires the full licensing here in Switzerland. Okay. So I can't just go into the shop and buy one if I can find it. European stuff I can find. Mm-hmm. Continental European. Not many Snyders and Martinis around here.
Right.
And trapdoors very, very rarely, which is the two that would always come back are the Martini, which is why I absolutely had to have you to do it, and the trapdoor, which I'm still hoping to find someone to do.
Right.
Well, knows the trapdoor very well.
The trapdoor is not something, an arm that I own right now, but I can empathize with the requests that you get. Is that especially when it comes in relation to the Snyder in particular, being a conversion of an older rifle, and the trapdoor having that lineage. It's something that always comes up, and obviously predominantly with, I would say, both our American viewers in that sense, for sure. So what rifles what rifle did you start with, or set of rifles did you start with on this project? And maybe if you could explain that and then go through and maybe just illuminate for us the rifles that you've covered so far.
Yeah, I mean, the first idea, as I said, was just a direct comparison. Now I've tended to do single rifles, but the idea, I said, the original idea was this comparison. So I started with the Gra, basic bolt action, and it has an ejector, which is something that, for example, most people think of the Mauser 71 as the basic bolt action, which is, yes, it came before the Gra, but it doesn't have an ejector. Okay. So you still have to tip out the cartridge. I didn't have one of those, but I did have a Gra. This was also an opportunity to do some machining because I needed to prepare the cases so that they would eject. Mm-hmm. So it all blended into one. And as the non-bolt action, I had the Comblain, which is, let's say, on par with the Martini. It's a dropping breech, but it has a lever action. It's a straight eject, easy to load. So those were the two that I paired off against each other.
Right. And to date, then, what other rifles have you introduced into the series?
The next one I did was the Werder, which took some time because the mechanism needed tuning since it's effectively clockwork.
That rifle's got quite an ejection mechanism built in.
Yeah, it's well, I've got plenty of videos on how it works, but you have the rear trigger, which operates as normal, and then you have what looks like a backwards front trigger, and that trips the breech down and ejects at the same time. Okay. So if you have incredibly long fingers, you can pull the trigger and immediately slam your trigger finger forward again. So you fire eject and you're ready to reload straight away without having to move your firing hand out of the trigger guard effectively. Right, okay. But the trouble with these Mad Minutes, especially these old rifles, is that you have to be sure that everything is going to work. The rifle itself and the ammunition.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point, because it's not always just the mechanism of the rifle, but it's the serviceability of the ammunition too that relates to this. And I know whether it's a sticky extraction out of a Martini or quite frankly, especially with cases, in my case, that have been used a great number of times, that, the shoulders start elongating ever so slightly, and you don't really know that until that next time that you use them to reload. You go to chamber and you're like, oh boy, it needs a bit of extra oomph, and you're jamming your thumb in there trying to get it chambered. So I can speak to what you're talking about there and empathize with you about that. It's definitely a two-part combination to get everything working.
Yeah, the Werder one I think I did 3 times in total. I don't have access. Well, I have access to the range, but free time to get there is limited. So it took about a year to do a run. Something went wrong. I don't have enough rounds to do another run. Put it off till next time. Then the spring breaks, and so on.
Right.
But so that was the Werder. Then I did the Dreiser versus Chaspo shoot-off. That was, it belongs to the Mad Minute because I did it in the same format, but it was basically to pit one against the other. They're both bolt actions. And there's one which is not yet published. That is the Swiss Peabody.
Okay.
As well.
So that will have an interesting adjunct to the Martini, I would expect then.
Yeah, exactly. I can tell you now that it didn't run as fast as you did.
It runs with?
Well, it didn't run as fast as a Martini.
Okay.
Obviously, you've got to cock the action.
Right.
You have an extra thing to do. But it was faster than I expected. I thought I was going to have to labor, but actually the reloading action is quite natural, like a Martini. So far on mine, I have 10 shots to the Comblain, 10 shots for the Gra, 10 shots for the Werder, 10 shots for the Chaspo, 7 shots for the Dreiser, but that's just a consequence of its complicated loading drill. And I have 9 for the Peabody.
Okay. Wow.
So
it sounds to me, as the numbers that you've alluded to, then, I mean, they're very much quite similar. And in retrospect, when you look back, whether it's 9 or 10 or 11, like that doesn't. It's interesting for a comparison purposes, but in terms of the actual reality of its use on the battlefield, perhaps, whether it's 9 or 10 in a one sort of evolution deal, it doesn't really, speak to. If it was like 3 or 4 and 9 or 10, that would really speak to a big difference or a big, generational leap. But, when you're talking about around 10, they all seem to pretty much have the same kind of capability in that sense. Eh?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in my cases, I watched through my stuff while I was checking my numbers here, and every time I've had something that's delayed me, whether it's a stuck on chambering or stuck on ejection, or I can't pull the case out of my pouch for some reason. I can't find it. So in every case, potentially I can get another 1 or 2 if everything went perfectly.
Right.
Which brings me to my compliment on your runs, because everything worked brilliantly on yours, and we can tell that you've been studying the manipulation and drills, because you're hardly looking at the weapon itself. You're going through the movements mechanically as a trained soldier would have done.
Right.
And
there's certainly an advantage to practice in that sense.
Yeah, and I was looking at my runs and I'm frantic, whereas you're very composed, and it's sort of like a metronome. Bang, load, bang, load, bang, load. And he was hypnotic. So congratulations.
Well, it was. It's fun, especially giving a context in relation to your experiments. And I know I've done some rapid shooting with both these rifles before, but not sort of set up as a direct to inject into your series. And so it's one of those things that you mentioned, when you get set up, you're ready to go, and you're like, oh no, what's going to happen this time? Something's going to break, something's going to fall off, I'm going to fumble something or drop a cartridge on the ground and have to pick it up. But I think that those kinds of happenings during a shooting evolution like this, like it all comes out in the wash, doesn't it? That whether you're fumbling in the pouch, I mean, that's what you've set up the experiments to sort of replicate. So that last minute, perhaps, of an attack where you're standing in line with those beside you, and it comes time for the volleys are ceasing, and now it's a question of some independent firing. The target has appeared, or the massive enemy are coming towards it. Whatever the situation, hypothetically could be, but this is the sort of those very small applications or those small windows where this kind of firing may have happened, right? So in those senses, those little hiccups, they would be happening by to everybody that you're standing with, whether it's
absolutely
that person, the sight fell down, or they couldn't see their target properly because of the smoke, or they dropped a cartridge, or their weapon misfired, all those kinds of things.
Sticky cases. Yep.
Exactly. So, the rifle's extra fouled because of firing earlier in the day, or you name it. So I don't think that as part of the evolution that you and now I have sort of undertaken here, that it's not really that run is a complete wash because I dropped, or I pulled a cartridge backwards out of the pouch and I had to fiddle with it to get it the right way around. All that kind of stuff is par for the course, as far as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I was leading to was that because yours went without a hitch, like the maximum with 12 with the Martini, that makes me think that's also, comparing with my numbers, that's pretty much the maximum you can sensibly expect for sensibly aimed fire in a minute. Otherwise, you go any faster, you're just putting lead down range and hoping.
Right. Which is something that I appreciate what you did in setting up this series, is that you had the aspect of an actual target that you were trying to hit. And it wasn't just simply like a speed trial. Because I know it's it often comes into play in, discussions, especially on the internet, about the fact that shooting fast doesn't really need to have anything to do with aiming. It's just about, getting lead out there. And personally, that's something that I just, it makes my skin crawl, because it just, if you're not hitting what you're shooting at, then whatever you're doing is absolutely irrelevant. Right? That there always has to be that aspect of aiming and trying to hit what you're shooking at, right? As far as I'm concerned, anyway. And I appreciate that with what you made sure to include that as far as what your experiments.
Although I wasn't always successful.
But what it does, though, it also, there's an extra amount of time that's taken because you have to aim, or you're at least trying to aim, right? And whether, if you're doing something strictly, demonstrate the speed of the action where there is no aiming, well, then that time can be used for another evolution of loading and firing. But because you actually are bringing the rifle into the shoulder, you're actually aiming at a target, even if it's for a short period of time, but you're still trying. And that, that brings some delay into the proceedings. But it's important from my standpoint that is included.
Yeah, and it's also looking at the videos. It's also incredible the difference you have when you're doing it, shooting the rifle. I was looking at the Gra run, and I'm basically shouting at the screen saying, "Pull the trigger." But of course, when you remember doing it, it feels like you throw the cartridge in, you throw the bolt closed, shoulder it, fire.
Right.
When you look at it, it's actually far longer.
Time flies.
What are you doing? Fun, what are you doing? You're clearly aiming. You clearly see the target. Why don't you pull the trigger? And
just trying to get that extra little bit of aiming in, right?
Yes, it's and I guess it must have been the same for them. They were shooting as fast as they thought they could, and maybe to the outsider, it looks like they're taking all the time in the world.
Right. Well, it's funny that it's something that I've often discussed on my channel. Just the relative, one, importance, and two, instances of shooting like this. That we're coming from an era that has no motorized transport. We're coming from an era, especially in the British context, of more often than not, is some sort of colonial campaigning, which means extra extended supply lines. And so, but quite frankly, ammunition is not something that is readily at hand. That yes, the group, the column, the company, the battalion may have its ammunition with it, but you're carrying 60, 70 rounds per person.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, my context is the same with the French weapons. It's the same, more or less the same continents, the same color, right. The colony next door.
And given the context, then sort of unbridled application of firepower, although there may or may not be a need for it, the ramifications of exercising it are huge, because you'll run out of ammunition so quickly.
Yes.
And at least to say in the British context, the emphasis, especially in this sort of Martini-Snyder era, and on in, quite frankly, in right up to the Boer War, was this almost insistence of firing in volleys and by command, because that gave a number of aspects that were seen to be beneficial, and both in control, in making sure people were aiming, giving time, and forcing people to take the time to aim, but also in the control of the expenditure of ammunition. And as we are well aware, is the control or the mitigation of smoke, really.
Yes.
If you fire too fast, especially if the weather conditions aren't blustery, then you're very quickly going to blind yourself. So there's a number of aspects, I think, that come into this whole thing of sort of rapid firing, and that the instances of actually using it to the degree that let's just say that we're practicing it here, we're probably a lot less than one might think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this leads me to a point that has been mentioned in my comments quite a lot, and I thought I'd pick your brains on. Some people say, why don't you put the rounds, 5 rounds or between your fingers, and then you'll be faster.
Yeah.
Now I keep on replying that this would be highly impractical, because as soon as you trying to work the action, you're going to let go of those rounds in your fingers. But to my knowledge, this is was never, certainly never doctrine. I can't exclude that, some soldiers did it. But to my knowledge, this was never a thing.
It can't have been a thing. I mean, it's something that, does it afford you a faster sort of reset time, especially in the context of a single shot breech loader? Absolutely, it does, because they're right there. But
yeah,
it's sort of like having to, in the case of, I'll bring the Lee Metford, the magazine, Lee Metford magazine, Snyder-Enfield, is using the magazine and then having to recharge the magazine. Yeah, what you're doing is creating this little ready supply. It's so it's like a rangeism, some sort of gimmicky sort of internet thing.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
And to say that, okay, everyone, prepare for 3 rounds or whatnot. It doesn't. And then everyone pulls rounds out and, fiddling with them, sticking them between their fingers of their left hand. And then when it comes time there, it's just, the concept to me has been lost out there, as it were, as something that appears on the surface to be beneficial in terms of being able to have faster rates of fire and whatnot. But when you combine it with the realities of the militaries of the era, the tactics that were used, specifically the fire tactics that were used, and the fact that it just doesn't fit, and very much a gimmicky kind of thing.
This is not Hollywood.
No, it's not. And I have fielded the similar kinds of comments and questions on British muzzleloaders, and that's always been my answer. And it's one of the things that, when it has come time to talk about on the channel, on the Firepower series, regarding any kind of, well, in this case, the Snyder or the Martini, or for the Lee Metford as well, is that is something specifically not done, because we're trying to, I'm trying to do things in a sort of quasi sort of military context, and that just doesn't have a place in it whatsoever. Now, what I think that perhaps might is in the event of shooting from some sort of defensive position. I hate to always harp on it, but like look at Rourke's drift as an example. In the case of the Martini, where you're standing behind a barricade, and is there an opportunity to break open a pack of ammunition and lay it on the barricade in front of you? That was
my next point I was going to ask.
Yeah. Well, I think that, did that happen? Sure. You're in a static position. The big pile of ammunition is literally right behind you, and there's somebody with a box of it that's going to come up and resupply you. So it's not like you're, Helen gone off on top of a mountain, and you may have to move in a second or two or a minute. So if you break open a package of cartridges and lay it on the ground, it sounds like a good idea. But what happens if you get two cartridges in, and now you've got to move?
Yeah, you're gonna leave them.
And when you move, you need to move now, because I'm telling you to move now. The bugle sounds, and it's like stand up, about turn, and a double march. Well, you have time to sit there and muck around with picking up loose cartridges off the ground, and it doesn't make military sense in that sense. And that's why something that I've on my experiments, again, much like you've done, is you stayed away from those kinds of things and relied on the sort of the basic techniques out of the pouch. And quite frankly, it doesn't really matter what kind of pouch it is. If it's on your belt in generally the same location as maybe historically, then it can be a leather one, it could be a fabric one. It doesn't really matter. It's the fact that you're having to fish into it and pull out another round that's important, right?
Yeah. This is odd. When I was looking back at the Gra, I found some later pictures, some uniform, and they have a belly pouch, which I thought was a little odd for rank, because if you're shooting from your right, you're having to reach under the rifle, to dip into your pouch, rather than having it around to the side. Right. But they're far from the only ones. But the Swiss, the same. They had for the Vetterli, they had a big pouch on the stomach, which was okay. So I put it around to the side, and then as long as it's always in the same place, that's all that counts.
Right. Well, and I think that sort of ticks that box, as it were, right? You're using something out of a pouch, and whether it's in the center of your belt or off to the right or something along those lines. And that's an important aspect, I think, rather than just having them laid out on the table in front of you or something like that, right?
Yeah, which is what we've allowed ourselves to do in the normal Mad Minute series. There we'll have the clips or the rounds or the speed loaders there on the ground next to us.
Right.
But yeah, that would, as you say, it may have been used in a defensive situation, but
sure,
generally in the field you'd be loading from the pouch.
Well, certainly, especially if there's any kind of needing to maneuver anywhere and move somewhere.
Yeah.
Then, pulling out 100 rounds and putting them in front of you may be really good if you're standing on the fire step of a trench, but it won't be any good for you if you're having to move after firing 5 of them.
Yeah. It was interesting to see on the Snyder, if I counted correctly, you did 8 rounds, almost 9, so close to being 9. But I've seen so Brett Gibbons from Paper Cartridges, he's done it. He had 8 as well, and I got sent a video from someone else in Canada who did some incidental competition with a Snyder, and managed to cut a 1-minute clip out of the series. So from moment of firing, I timed one from the first shot. I timed 1 minute,
and how many rounds?
It was also 8 rounds. Seems to be the magic number for Snyder. You were looking worried there. Shall I publish it?
Yeah, absolutely publish that for sure.
He was from sitting, and he had a box just on the ground, loading from picking out from there. So comparable, but equally hard work.
So do you have any, you mentioned the Peabody has been filmed but not published yet, but is there any other rifles that you have sort of waiting in the wings in the black powder department?
No, that's partly simply due to my decision just to restrict myself to French military firearms, simply for my own sanity. And I would love to go around collecting all sorts of single shots, but I have to remain realistic. So it's, if I manage to get access to something else, or unfortunately it's very difficult here also to borrow.
Okay.
Again, because these rifles are just over the licensing cutoff, it's awfully complicated to borrow unless I get together with the owner and then do it together. So they have to be present on the range.
I see. And
then I can use it. So, but potentially I'll have access to a Vandal.
Okay.
Which is the rotating bolt with a percussion lock, which it's going to be comparable to Peabody. Instead of reaching for a lever, you have a thumb piece.
Okay.
Well, that's the action.
It comes flipped this way, right?
Yeah, it rotates on a longitudinal axis.
Yeah.
And if it's balanced correctly, it's a bistable system. So you need to start rotating the action, and then the spring takes over and completes either closing or opening. And when it opens, it slams the ejector. So it's a good system. I used to have one. I don't expect it to be any quicker, but it'd be interesting to be able to try it at speed.
Sure. Yeah. And it's the ergonomic piece obviously is something that's important. And with all these different systems and ideas that were floating around at the time to try and eke out sort of the best, as it were, in terms of, but also balanced then with the power of the intended cartridge and all those kinds of things. So all those things came into play. That
I mean, the cartridges are basically all pretty much identical. They're all 45-ish.
Right.
I think probably the Martini has probably got the higher loading. Certainly none of them have hit as hard as a fully military loaded Martini cartridge. But I think in terms of the cartridge, it's pretty comparable.
The French cousin of the Snyder is the
tabatière.
Tabatière.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I will have access to one of those as well.
Well, because that would definitely be an interesting comparison with the Snyder, because they're very similar, right?
Yeah, it's essentially it's similar. The main difference is that the Schneider effectively extract straight back and backwards. You can eject by tilting the rifle up rather than sideways. Right. Although there's a sort of S bend at the back, because they really cut out a deep groove in the wrist of the stock.
Right.
So there's a little dip in to get to the chamber, because it's 18 millimeter. It's a huge thing. So it's, I don't think, I had one a long time ago. The extraction's good, but you like the Snyder, you still need to do something to eject it out.
Right.
Whether you tilt it sideways or up, straight back. Yeah. The other ones I have are the Milbank Armsler, the Swiss ones. They are trapdoor type systems, but unfortunately they're both rimfire. And the only way is to fire using the eccentric blank trick. And yeah, you need to line that one up for each shot. So there's no hope of doing that.
Not conducive to rapid fire.
To rapid firing. However, they eject pretty nicely.
Yeah. They
extract and eject pretty nicely. It's the same sort of kicker like a trapdoor. Not quite as strong, but especially for the 10.4 one, it's a smaller cartridge as well. So I mean, I've done in the videos of it when I'm shooting on the range. You can see the case comes out.
Right.
But no, I won't be running those. But again, it would be, I would guess, like the Snyder, so around the 8-9 rounds maximum.
And obviously, without having to line up the blank insert into the rimfire cartridge, you just put it in and it would fire, right? So
exactly, yeah.
Well, I think
there was one more thing. Was circling back to the idea of training, and also the Vetterli, because after I'd done the Mad Minute with that, I finally discovered some copies of the manual for it. And I was surprised to see that there was a rapid fire exercise. And so
yes, this is very interesting.
1870s.
Yeah.
Early 1870s, when the full deployment is out there. But it wasn't. The exercise was just to get used to the idea of it.
Okay.
So a target was there. You had 15 rounds. I can't remember what the time was. I think it was 1 minute or 1 minute 20 or something like that. There was no expectations of accuracy. It was just to get the soldier used to rapid fire, I guess, should it be necessary. So it wouldn't come as a surprise, which I thought was an interesting idea, which I hadn't come across. Well, I don't know if that has been, if you've come across a similar idea, not to have it as a skill to acquire, but as something to experience.
Right. That aspect I've never seen in sort of British and Empire context. The first mention of something specifically rapid comes with the Martini in the late 1880s. I think, and I'd have to just check my references, but it's certainly in the 80s. And a part of one of these field firing exercises, and it's like a practice F or something like that in the manual, is essentially 10 rounds allotted, but a 1 minute time frame, and that the expectation is that you fire those 10 rounds in the 1 minute, and that is the first written practice in a musketry program that comes around within the British and Empire context. So
Okay.
not for,
Yep.
I mean, as far as you answered the question I was going to ask was what the date associated with the Vetterli Rapid was, and it's considerably earlier.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they advantage of because they've skipped a step and gone to a repeater. But it was interesting that because they essentially they used it as they were still encouraged to fire in volleys. So he was still firing on command. So it's not, we got a magazine rifle, we're just going to dump rounds down the mountain. So you were still expected to carry on as if you were effectively had a single shot rifle. They were not shy on expenditure or inclined that the soldiers would necessarily empty the magazines and panic. But yeah, it was just the whole thing was interesting. Also, the fact that they've given them 15 rounds, not that you would ever fire that many in the time allotted, but it also means you have to include a reload,
right?
Which was, again, maybe it was just to get used to the idea of reloading under stress.
Well, that's quite an advanced feature, because reloading doesn't actually come into play in the British context until the very early 1900s. That the practices of the musketry program right up to the Boer War and after all have whatever the rounds that you're expending in that practice can all be contained within the magazine. So there's no actual reloading until you get into charger loading in an actual practice. And of course, that's a bit outside the preserve of our discussion here, but the whole practice 22 moving forward from 1909 into 1914 and into the Great War, the reload was part of the drill and very much part of the dry training that people would undertake, repeatedly and regularly during the year. So I find it very interesting that aspect specifically is included in the Swiss doctrine so early on. Yeah,
I'm guessing it's a direct consequence of the very early dive into repeaters.
Sure.
Because there will not have been, well, perhaps for the Peabodys, but I haven't found the regulations for that use. I don't expect, especially when they were intended initially for the sharpshooters, which certainly would not have been expected to be in the front line and having to dump rounds rather quickly. They were skirmishers.
Right. Well, I think anyway, very interesting discussion. And as I alluded to at the beginning, that for me, it's particularly interesting watching your efforts on Bloke on the Range, because there are these rifles that I may have been aware of, but certainly not handled, and not only handled, but also shot. And so watching you go through the evolutions, and especially in the case of like the Dryza and the Chassepot, is the fact that you've had to meticulously make all these, in those cases, very incredibly complex cartridges, and then watch you then handle the rifle, handle the ammunition, and some of the, they're paper, so you need to be able to handle them with a certain degree of, I don't say delicacy, but they don't have the robustness as a metallic cartridge, undeniable.
Well, I mean, for the Mad Minute with the Mad Minute with the Chassepot, I actually have an even simpler way of reloading it now, which actually makes use of bubble tea straws. So
who knew?
They're relatively thick. It's borderline cardboard paper. Waxy. So it's actually extremely, I can, all I need to do is cut the tubes to length, and then they're actually faster to load than metallic cartridges.
Really?
Yeah. I will show everyone how it's done somewhere else.
Well, there you go. There's a great little tidbit moving on from this video. Stay tuned for the extra expedient Chassepot cartridge.
Exactly. So they handle like a metallic cartridge. They're not gonna bend like the original ones would have, because you've got a big heavy lead bullet tied on to a powder pack,
right?
Effectively. So actually the most problems, the thing that comes to mind with Chassepot is, it's going to foul very quickly, and the needle's going to break. which is the two things. Now, the needle is highly unlikely to break just because of the way the bolt works, and the fact that only at most 10 mil is going to stick out when it fires. I have yet to ever break one, including the originals that are still in the guns. And fouling, as far as I have seen, has never been a legitimate historical problem. I haven't seen anything that's caused, and it hasn't been the cause of any major defeat or anything. The ammunition itself seems to be where the real problems come from. Is the fragility,
Right.
in terms of robustness, in terms of moisture sensibility. If you're not looking at what you're doing, you can simply just bend it, snap it in two when you're trying to load it. If it does get a kink in it, even when you shot the bolt, the base isn't going to line up with the needle and it won't go off, and so on. So you've got all sorts of problems that come in that way.
Right.
The Dreiser has the advantage in that respect, whereas because the cartridge is very short, stubby, it fits. It doesn't have any air space in the chamber when you chamber it. So the primer will always be presented to the needle.
Right.
And you also have the primer that is directly seated in the sabot with a big heavy bullet behind it, so you've got a nice hard surface to strike against, even if the powder bit gets slightly damaged or something like that. So it's an interesting test because technologically speaking, the Chassepot is way ahead, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better in terms of practical warfare.
Right. Well, as I say, I mean, it's been a really interesting watching you know, every time one of these comes up, it's something that interests me in particular, because of my experience on British muzzleloaders with the rifles that I have, and being able to sort of compare the not only just the strict rate of fire, but just the ergonomics and how they work and that kind of thing. And then you add some of the, you know, the ammunition videos that you've done as well, as terms of which it sheds light on the actual complexity of some of these things. It's just, which are staggering. But I think, I hope anyway, that bringing the Martini and the Snyder into this picture sort of maybe broadens the panoply of arms that are brought into the series. So I want to appreciate
absolutely
is your request to bring this into the fold. I had a good time.
I was hounding him for ages, ladies and gentlemen.
I know, ages. I'm thankfully that we've got it done and we've moved ahead, and we've had this wonderful discussion as an adjunct to the actual shooting, which I hope viewers of both channels will appreciate. And
absolutely.
Anyway, I think without further ado, we could probably end the discussion there, and look forward to, Fab, your further efforts and to your Peabody video and the eventual acquisition of some of the holes in your collection.
Absolutely. And and if you have managed to get your hands on anything else that I either cannot or will not acquire due to my strict personal rules, then please do contribute again and run a series.
Sure, absolutely. Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks, Fab.
Thanks. See you next time.
Okay.
For all your Snyder or Martini reloading needs, talk to Martin at X-Ring Services.
If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.